ball field, you might have 5, 6, 7 joints.
I would say more than that.
More?
Yeah, I think more than that. And I haven't, like, say, I've seen them on the trucks, they're all uniform size, and they would probably, I think I saw a truck coming down here yesterday, and there were about 7 or 8 of these pieces, and then those are welded together. But you gotta realize, things have been kind of slow in the pipeline business and getting these constructed, and these have been sitting outside and they're rusting. And are they American steel?
No. Do you know the answer to that? Are they American steel?
Some of them. Is Rover, I can't say that. I just have, the different ones that I've looked at, and but I do know that corrosion is causing issues, and I've seen the corrosion on Rover's pipes as they travel, so it is a big concern. And also, you're dealing with these construction workers that are coming in, they're being put under pressure to get the work done. They want, Rover's saying by the end of this year, they're gonna start flowing unless we stop them. Right now, Oil Change International has a petition going around, and it is to stop them until these evaluations can be done. And if they're gonna do what they did before and give us one state hearing to talk about the wetlands, they might as well keep it. It does us no good whatsoever.
So in the past, when the pipes have fractured or broken or caused eruptions, I think there was one in West Virginia that was quite incredible. Is there any, do you know of any studies that have done anything with where they're most, is the ground shift, what happens to cause a pipe to break?
There could be many reasons why a pipe would break, but the ground shifting, if you're working where they're doing injections and, the fault line gets fractured, or, the earth shifts, that's what she does. And I think that to answer that question would be, the only thing that we know is that at 5%, their monitors are going to catch it. So at 5%, that means that we are already breathing whatever is coming out of those pipelines. And that's already contaminated the soil and, basically won't recover. I've heard years ago that 1 gallon of oil, I think it's a gallon of oil takes several, it may never dissipate into where it's a usable soil again.
Mm-hmm.
A 5% leakage.
Before they can tell that there's a problem on their pipeline. So
that seems hard to understand in itself. Is it 5% in this one little spot, all of a sudden 5%?
It's pressure.
5% is.
So
there has to be a pressure in the whole line.
Yes, and you're going to go, in some lines, in the Sunoco line, the old wartime line, it goes 10 miles before there's even a way to detect it. So it could be anywhere along that 10 miles, the way I understand it.
Thank you.
My name is John Howell, and I'm from Athens, Ohio. And I'm retired professor of physiology from the university here, and the coordinator of Democracy Over Corporations, an organization which is one of the sponsors of this event, as a matter of fact. Although we have other organizations who have done much more work to bring it about than ours, namely the people from Torch. So I'm grateful to them and to you for your efforts and participation. So I'd like to speak about human rights. Are they being violated by fracking? Is fracking an injustice? And to start with a question, what is the relation between rights and democracy? The idea of human rights is historically relatively recent. My understanding is that prior to about the 1400s, there was no word in the European languages that even conveyed the idea of human rights as it exists today. Previously, the people who had rights were kings. They were divine rights. What the rest of the people had were duties and moral expectations arising either from religious or philosophical traditions imposed these duties. But with the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, thinking began to change. Although the idea of democracy had, of course, arisen in early Greek and Roman periods and had some limited manifestation in practice, by the 1700s, a new manifestation of democracy was emerging, namely the American experiment. The American experiment turned thinking upside down, or what we should really say is that it turned thinking right side up. No longer were the monarchs to be the rulers of the people, but the people were to be the rulers of those who represented them in government. The idea that people had natural rights, inalienable rights, became translated into political reality through the Bill of Rights and the Constitution. Now, natural inalienable rights recognized by philosophers, Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and others, became political rights. It's interesting that Thomas Paine, one of the important people in the early revolutionary period in this country, argued that such natural rights should not become political rights because political rights can be taken away by changing governments. Natural rights, on the other hand, are inalienable and can never be taken away. But what we know is that rights vanish under tyranny. They vanish under poverty, and they vanish in the chaos of war. The American experiment was far from perfect in terms of rights. Initially, rights were effectively limited, of course, to property-owning white males. The American story has been a continuous struggle toward equality for all people, a struggle for rights to be recognized in law, political rights, like the end of slavery, of women's suffrage, and of equal protection under the law. And economic rights, like Social Security, the GI Bill, and Medicare, and Medicaid. Just as a recognition of these rights was new when they were first brought into political reality, today's world demands consideration of newly defined rights that have been mentioned many times today. So I ask the question, well, what is required to protect rights? Well, to protect against the loss of rights through tyranny, elections must be fair and free, not purchased or otherwise manipulated. To protect against the loss of rights through poverty, governments must counteract the natural tendency of wealth to become concentrated in the hands of fewer and fewer people. To protect against the loss of rights through war, governments must pursue policy that look beyond fear. The 1948 Declaration of Human Rights by the UN seemed like a major step forward, a global agreement that natural rights do exist and should be recognized and protected politically. The reality on the ground, however, is political, and many remain deprived of rights, even of the most basic rights, the right to life, liberty, and security of person. The Declaration articulates that the responsibility of governments is to protect rights. It's interesting that the 1948 Declaration of Human Rights by the UN said nothing about environmental rights, but the world has changed since 1948. And now the threats to life, liberty, and security of persons posed by environmental and climate change have become obvious. We see threats to our lives and to our security of persons from the poisoning of the air we breathe, poisoning of the water we use for drinking and bathing, and poisoning of the soils which grow our food. We've seen the chaos and human suffering of mass migrations arising from war and poverty, and the rising seas from global warming will produce still more. A right is an entitlement. But to what extent does a right require responsibility? Are we really entitled to anything we don't work for? The idea of fairness, that is to say justice, can be interpreted in two ways. Fairness can mean we get what we deserve, or it can mean we all get something, regardless of how deserving we are. Now, there are roles for both of these approaches, but they are sometimes in competition with one another. Are we entitled to health care no matter how we treat our bodies? Are we entitled to employment compensation, whether we're looking for a job or not? How much health care? How much employment compensation? These are difficult issues with no easy answers. Politically, they require negotiation and compromise. Nonetheless, there are basic rights to which we are all entitled, regardless of how deserving we may be or we may not be. Which rights fall under that category and how they are implemented may differ between cultures. The effects of climate change, however, will be profound and will affect all. Developed countries have contributed more to global warming than less developed countries and have the greatest responsibilities to reduce their contributions to the problem. Does fracking violate our rights? In his essay On Liberty, published in 1859, John Stuart Mill put forward the harm principle, stating that the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his or her will is to prevent harm to others. So it's not sufficient to argue that prohibiting some behavior or requiring some behavior is good for someone. To exercise that power requires us to show harm to others. I think the testimony today has shown beyond a shadow of a doubt that fracking and our dependence upon fossil fuels in general is doing harm now, and if continued, will do much greater harm in the future through contamination of water supplies, air pollution, and global warming. How do we protect our rights to clean air, water, and soils? Shall the extraction and use of fossil fuels be reduced by state or federal regulations, or by prohibition, community by community? Now, no one is arguing at the present time for immediate prohibition of extraction and use of all fossil fuels. Such a step would do great harm, of course. How then shall we reduce the use of fossil fuels toward zero to affect the great harm global warming is and will be causing to life, liberty, and security of persons? It would be nice to think that voluntary actions and economic incentives will be sufficient. These will be important, but too many short-term economic incentives work the wrong way. Regulation and prohibition will be necessary. Too often, regulation fails because regulatory policies are unduly influenced by those who profit from the activity being regulated. This is a failure of democracy itself, resulting from elections that aren't free and fair, elections which are bought or otherwise manipulated. Nonetheless, pressure must be brought to bear on regulatory agencies to respect the rights of local citizens. The right to life itself must mean the right to a healthy life, free of human-produced toxins which produce sickness and death. Local communities must also be able to say no to commercial activities which violate their rights. From the beginning, human rights have been intended for humans, for real people. The extension of human rights to corporations is an abomination. It eviscerates democracy. It gives profit-driven corporations already laden with the power of concentrated wealth through limited liability, overwhelming legal power, power which makes a mockery of the democratic ideal that people rule. It leaves people powerless to resist corporate predation of their communities. It must be reversed. Corporations are legitimate and important parts of our social structure, but corporate interests must not dictate public policy. Public policy must serve public interests, must serve the people. In the meantime, communities of people must claim their rights through adopting laws that prohibit activities such as fracking, which violate the people's right to clean air, water, and soils. These laws must deny rights claimed by corporations, which are violating people's rights. Although state laws may attempt to preempt such local lawmaking, the right to life must prevail over corporate claims of the right to profit. Otherwise, the idea of democracy is meaningless. Do the people rule or do the corporations rule? As a growing number of communities adopt laws to prohibit fracking, society and markets will adjust, and we will move toward renewable sources of energy and away from the fossil fuels, which offer short-term convenience but a dreadful long-term prospect. Let regulation and prohibition work together toward a future for our children, a future with life, health, and democracy.
Well said. So, I understand what you said. I actually support what you said, although I don't have an opinion here. I'm just a facilitator. But that's not what happens. That's not what we heard here today. We heard that local groups can't do things. Local groups cannot pass local laws and not have preempted by the Ohio.
That's pretty depressing. But every social movement that has moved rights forward has been through times when they said, it's hopeless. We can't overcome these things. And yet people kept working on it. Women voted despite the fact it was illegal. Communities can take charge despite that it's illegal according to state law. And we have to do that. It's going to take a lot of work to bring people along to be able to come to that point. But it took a long time for women's suffrage. It took a long time for the civil rights movement. And I think we are in a kind of a thing where we are so challenged in terms of our ability to have justice and reasonable democracy that we have to realize that it has to be a mass movement, it has to be built over time, and we have to have patience and strength to try to do this, and the fortitude to stick with it. Because you're right, you look at it in the short term and it looks hopeless.
Well, I did not say it looks hopeless.
Good.
I'm a true believer. I'm
Good.
just saying, I'm just commenting on what we've heard here.